December 17, 1967, Victoria, Australia. Cheviot Beach. The water is rough, the kind of rough that makes experienced sailors nervous. The kind of rough that the locals know by instinct. Stay out, stay back. Watch from the cliffs and appreciate that the sea is not your friend today. Harold Holt did not watch from the cliffs. He was 59 years old. He was the sitting Prime Minister of Australia. He had held office for less than 2 years, but in those 2 years he had shaped the direction of the nation, committing troops to Vietnam, strengthening ties with Washington, navigating the Cold War politics of the Asia-Pacific with the confidence of a man who had waited 30 years for his moment. He was, at that moment, one of the most powerful men in the Southern Hemisphere, and he walked into the ocean like he owned it, because he always had. Then the waves closed over him. He did not come back. No body, no wreckage, no explanation. Australia would search for him with ships and aircraft and divers. They would search for days. They would find nothing. The sea gave nothing back, and then one of the most powerful nations in the world would declare its leader legally dead. On the same day, he disappeared. Not weeks later. Not after a thorough investigation, the same day, December 17, 1967. That is where this story begins, and in some ways, in the ways that matter most, it has never ended. Harold Holt was not a man who did things halfway. He was born on August 5, 1908 in Sydney. His father was a theatrical entrepreneur. His mother died when Harold was young. He was raised partly in boarding schools, partly in the machinery of ambition that shaped Australian public life in the early 20th century. He studied law at the University of Melbourne. He was sharp, he was disciplined. He was the kind of man who did not simply succeed, he worked at succeeding, consciously and deliberately. By the time he was elected to the House of Representatives in 1935, he was 26 years old. Not a prodigy, a man who had prepared for exactly this. For 30 years, Harold Holt moved through Australian politics like a man who knew exactly where he was going. He served as Minister for Labour, he served as Treasurer. He was the man you put in charge of things that needed to be fixed, because Holt fixed things. He was also a man who moved easily through elite social circles. He was charming in the specific way that Australian politicians of his era needed to be, neither too formal nor too casual, able to speak to workers and to ambassadors with equal ease. He was photographed often. He was popular. He was, by the standards of 1960s politics, something like a celebrity. He also served during the Second World War, something that shaped his generation in ways that outsiders cannot fully appreciate. Australia's position in the Pacific War was existential. Japan was not an abstraction. Japan was close. Harold Holt understood that. It coloured everything about how he would later approach Australia's alliances, particularly with the United States. When Robert Menzies retired in January 1966, the Liberal Party of Australia chose Harold Holt to lead them. He became the 17th Prime Minister of Australia. After 3 decades in the game, he had reached the top. He was known as a charming man, an approachable man, a man who liked parties, liked company, liked the ocean. He was a skilled diver and an enthusiastic swimmer. Not just goes to the beach sometimes, genuinely skilled in open water. He had been diving on the Great Barrier Reef. He swam regularly. The sea was not a place Harold Holt feared. It was a place he loved. He was also, by all accounts, a man who found the constraints of the prime ministership genuinely frustrating. He liked action, he liked movement, he did not like being watched. That much, at least, is consistent with what happened on December 17, 1967. The morning started normally. Holt was at his beach house at Portsea on the Mornington Peninsula, a regular retreat. He had a group of friends with him. It was a Sunday. The weather was overcast, and the sea was described in every subsequent account the same way: heavy, treacherous. Holt wanted to swim at Cheviot Beach. This was not a surprise. He swam there regularly. His security detail, such as it was present, but Holt had a habit that drove them quietly mad. He waved them off. He was the Prime Minister of Australia. He did not need babysitters on the beach. What made this morning different, what in retrospect looks like a line drawn before the event, was how the sea looked. The people who were with him later described conditions that any experienced swimmer should have treated as a warning. The surf was described as heavy and treacherous. The swell was running hard. There was a strong lateral current. One of the people in the party, a woman named Marjorie Gillespie, later said she had urged Holt to reconsider. Others in the group were cautious about entering the water at all. Holt dismissed the concern. He said, and these words were quoted afterward with the weight they deserved, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." He entered the water at approximately 12:15 p.m. He was seen swimming strongly at first. The witnesses, there were several, watched him from the shore. He moved out into the surf. He swam with purpose and confidence, the way a man swims when he is entirely comfortable in his element. Then the sea caught him. Exactly what happened is impossible to say with certainty. What the witnesses saw was Holt caught by a wave, pulled sideways by the current, and then gone. Not gradually. Gone. The water took him with a sudden, indifferent violence that left no time for response. The people on the beach ran for help. They called, they searched the immediate area. Within the hour, an emergency response was underway. Harold Holt had vanished into the Tasman Sea. He was never seen again. What followed was one of the largest search operations in Australian history. HMAS ships were deployed. Royal Australian Navy divers went into the water at Cheviot Beach. A difficult and dangerous operation given the conditions that had just swallowed the Prime Minister. Royal Australian Air Force aircraft swept the coastline and the surrounding waters. Volunteer divers, police, Coast Guard. The resources of the state mobilized with urgent speed. The search ran for days, then weeks. They found nothing. Not a body, not a shoe, not a fragment of clothing, not a single piece of physical evidence that Harold Holt had ever entered that water. The ocean had taken everything. There is something uniquely disturbing about a disappearance with no physical trace. Most drownings, even difficult ones in rough seas, leave something. The sea is violent but not thorough. Bodies surface, debris washes ashore. The physical record of what happened persists in some form, even if it takes time. Cheviot Beach gave up nothing. The official position was established almost immediately, partly by necessity and partly because there seemed to be no alternative. Harold Holt had drowned. The sea had taken him. The body had been carried out by the current into water too deep and too disturbed to recover. On December 17, 1967, the same day he disappeared, Harold Holt was declared legally dead. No body, no confirmation. The same day, Australia's Parliament met. Tributes were paid. Prime Minister Harold Holt was mourned as a man taken by the ocean he loved. The official story was closed before anyone had time to notice it had been opened too quickly. Australia had to continue functioning. A Governor-General's Commission, a temporary Prime Minister, John McEwen of the Country Party, for a period of 23 days. Then John Gorton, who won the Liberal leadership and took the Prime Ministership in January 1968. The machinery of government moved forward because it had to. The nation mourned, briefly and incompletely, and then returned to the business of governing itself. But the question never went away. How could it? The Prime Minister of Australia, a modern democracy, a stable country with institutions and intelligence services and a navy, had walked into the sea in front of witnesses and simply ceased to exist. No body, no evidence, no explanation that fully satisfied. For nearly 4 decades, the official position was clear: drowning. The body was never recovered due to the force of the current. That was the answer. That was what you were supposed to accept. The coronial inquest that eventually convened, years later in 2005, was supposed to settle the question. Instead, it produced a finding that says more about the limits of certainty than the limits of investigation. The coroner examined all available evidence: witness testimony, the conditions at Cheviot Beach, Holt's physical state at the time, tidal and current data, the results of the extensive search operation. The finding: open. Not death by drowning, not confirmed, open, unable to determine the exact cause or manner of his disappearance. Let that sit for a moment. The official position of Australia, after a full coronial inquest, decades after the event, with every resource of the state applied to the question, is that the reason its Prime Minister disappeared is unknown. This is unusual. This is remarkable. This is the kind of finding that, in a case involving a private citizen, might be quietly filed away. In a case involving the serving head of government of a nation of millions, it is a statement that echoes. The ocean knew what happened. The rest of Australia was left with an open finding and 4 theories, none of which can be definitively proven or disproven. Theory 1. Harold Holt drowned. This is the official position. It is also the simplest explanation, and in most circumstances, the simplest explanation is the right one. The conditions at Cheviot Beach on December 17, 1967, were dangerous. Every witness account confirms this. The surf was rough, the current was strong, the undertow was powerful. These are the conditions in which even experienced swimmers die. They are, in particular, the conditions in which confident swimmers die, because confidence in rough water can become recklessness before you notice the transition. Holt was 59 years old. He was fit and experienced, but he was not a young man. The physical demands of the prime ministership, the late nights, the stress, the travel, would have taken a toll that no amount of swimming could fully counteract. The current in the area runs hard, the seabed drops off sharply, a body taken by the current and pulled into deep water could be carried kilometers from the shore before it had any chance of surfacing. In particularly cold or turbulent conditions, a body can remain submerged for an extended period before the natural processes of decomposition cause it to rise. In the case of Cheviot Beach, extended period apparently meant forever. The body was never found. This is unusual, but it is not impossible. People drown without their bodies being recovered. Fishermen are lost at sea, sailors vanish. The ocean is large and the currents are powerful, and not every disappearance leaves evidence. The case for drowning is strong. The evidence for it is the conditions, the witness accounts, the lack of any credible evidence for any other explanation, and the simple fact that people drown in exactly these circumstances every year. The case against it: no body, none, not a trace. In a highly surveilled near-shore environment, with an immediate and massive response, not one physical remnant. The simplest explanation is probably right. Probably. Theory 2. The Chinese submarine. In 1983, a British journalist and author named Anthony Gray published a book titled The Prime Minister Was a Spy. The thesis was extraordinary. Harold Holt had been a long-running Chinese intelligence asset. For years, possibly decades, he had been passing information to Beijing. On December 17, 1967, a Chinese submarine surfaced off Cheviot Beach. Harold Holt swam to it. He was extracted. He defected to China. He lived out his days in Beijing, his true identity known only to the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party. When you first hear this theory, it sounds like the plot of a thriller that went to a publisher who should have known better. But here is the thing about Anthony Gray's claim. He was not a crank. He was a serious journalist, the Reuters bureau chief in Beijing during the Cultural Revolution, imprisoned by the Red Guards for over 2 years. He had sources. He had context. He had a deep understanding of how Chinese intelligence actually operated during the Cold War. And the Cold War context matters enormously here. Harold Holt became Prime Minister at a moment when the Australia-United States alliance was the centerpiece of Australian foreign policy. He famously declared, in April 1966, all the way with LBJ, complete support for Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam policy. He tripled Australia's troop commitment to Vietnam. He was, publicly, one of the most committed American allies in Asia. But Holt also had a complicated relationship with China. He was one of the Australian politicians who, quietly, believed that isolation of the People's Republic was a strategic mistake. He maintained back channels to Beijing when doing so was politically toxic. He supported, privately, eventual recognition of the People's Republic of China at a time when the official policy was recognition of Taiwan. Was this a moderate pragmatist playing a long game? Or was it something else? Gray's evidence was never independently verified. His sources, such as they were, remained anonymous. No defector ever confirmed the account. No Chinese archive has produced a file on Harold Holt. The People's Republic of China, for its part, has never acknowledged the claim in any form, which is what you would expect whether it is true or false. Holt's official biographer, Tom Frame, examined the claim at length and found no persuasive evidence that Holt was a Chinese agent. But Frame also acknowledged that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, especially where intelligence operations are concerned. The submarine theory is extraordinary. It requires the existence of a long-running intelligence operation that left no verified trace. It requires a submarine to have been positioned off an Australian beach without detection. It requires Harold Holt to have been complicit in an elaborate deception that lasted decades. And yet, the Cold War produced exactly these kinds of operations. Cambridge 5, Kim Philby. The defection of Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean. These were inconceivable until they were confirmed. History is full of intelligence operations that seemed impossible until they weren't. No submarine has ever been confirmed. No defection has ever been confirmed. The theory rests entirely on a single book and its unverifiable sources. But the theory has never been definitively refuted either. Theory 3. The CIA. This is a variant of the intelligence extraction theory, but with different sponsors and different implications. The version most commonly circulated runs as follows. Harold Holt was not a Chinese asset, but an American one. He was a long-running CIA contact, feeding information about Australian politics, Australian intelligence, and Australian relationships in the Asian region back to Langley. At some point in late 1967, his cover was at risk, either because a leak within the CIA had exposed him, or because Australian counterintelligence was closing in, or because of some other pressure now lost to time. The CIA, faced with the exposure of a sitting prime minister as an American asset, an event that would have caused a catastrophic diplomatic crisis, decided to extract him. Not defect him publicly, extract him quietly. The drowning story was a cover. Holt was taken by a submarine or a small vessel, transported to a facility somewhere in the Pacific, given a new identity, and disappeared from public life permanently. Unlike the Chinese submarine theory, this version does not require Holt to have been a traitor. It requires him to have been an asset of an Allied intelligence service, something that was common during the Cold War and is not inherently incompatible with his known history and his known closeness to Washington. The evidence for this theory is, essentially, none. There is no document, no defector, no witness account that supports it. It exists as a logical possibility, given the parameters of Cold War intelligence operations. That is different from evidence. The CIA has never commented on the theory in any form. No Australian intelligence agency has confirmed or denied it. It remains, as it has always been, a theory constructed from possibilities rather than facts. But it is a possibility, and in the context of late 1960s Cold War intelligence operations, possibility is not nothing. Theory 4. Harold Holt walked away. This is the theory that feels most human and is perhaps the most difficult to sit with, because it requires us to imagine a very specific kind of desperation. The version that circulates runs as follows. Holt staged his own death. He walked into the ocean, he swam along the shore, not out to sea, and was extracted by a waiting vessel. He was given a new identity. He began a new life somewhere. He chose to disappear. The reasons given vary. A long-running affair. Holt is known to have had a complicated personal life. Mounting political pressures, he had faced significant policy challenges in the months before his death. Personal unhappiness. The rumors, never fully substantiated, that the public life he had built was not the private life he wanted. This theory requires Harold Holt to have been simultaneously a very good swimmer and a very good liar. It requires the cooperation of at least one other person. It requires the absence of any subsequent sighting or contact, no letter, no call, no leak, for nearly 60 years. The evidence against it is simply the passage of time. Secrets decay, people talk, deathbed confessions exist. The people who helped stage a disappearance grow old and careless. If Harold Holt is alive somewhere, or if anyone knowingly helped him disappear, the secret has held for 6 decades. Secrets of that magnitude, involving multiple people, almost never hold that long. Almost. The 2005 coronial inquest was supposed to be the end of this. A formal, thorough official examination of all available evidence conducted by a senior coroner with access to material that had not been publicly available. The last word. The coroner's finding was unable to determine the cause and manner of death. Open finding. This is not a verdict of "we suspect something unusual." An open finding is a formal legal acknowledgement that the available evidence is insufficient to reach a conclusion. It is, in its way, the most honest thing the Australian state could have said about the disappearance of Harold Holt. It is also a remarkable admission. The coroner considered the drowning theory carefully. He found it plausible, but could not confirm it without physical evidence. He considered the foul play theories and found no credible evidence supporting them. He considered the staged disappearance theory and found it unlikely, but could not rule it out entirely. Open, think about what that means. Australia mounted one of its largest ever maritime search operations. It had the resources of the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Australian Air Force, its intelligence services, its diplomatic networks. It had decades to investigate. It had access to foreign intelligence. It had, presumably, whatever information its American allies chose to share. And the best answer it could produce, after all of that, was, "We don't know." There is a quiet dignity in that answer. There is also something deeply unsettling about it. The head of government of a modern democratic nation disappeared in front of witnesses, and the state that he led cannot explain what happened to him. That is not a normal thing. That is not a thing that happens. Except that it happened. There is a building in Melbourne. It opened in 1969. It is a large public swimming complex, the kind of facility that communities build to serve their residents, to give people a place to exercise and teach their children to swim. It is called the Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre. The naming committee that chose this name was apparently entirely sincere. Harold Holt was an Australian Prime Minister. He died, officially, in the ocean. Naming a swimming facility after him seemed appropriate, a tribute, an honouring. The Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre is located in the Melbourne suburb of Glen Iris. It has been in continuous operation since 1969. It has an Olympic-size pool. It has a learner's pool. It has a cafe. It runs swimming lessons for children. It is named after a man who was last seen being consumed by the ocean. The Australians involved in the naming have been asked about this over the years. The most common response is a version of, "We thought it was appropriate because he loved the sea." This is technically accurate. It is also, in the context of the circumstances of his death, one of the most inadvertently dark memorial decisions in the history of public facility naming. The Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre remains open today. You can book a lane online. Harold Holt is one of only a handful of leaders in the democratic world to have died in office under circumstances that remain officially unexplained. There are parallels, disappearances, assassinations, accidents, but the combination of factors that define the Holt case is, if not unique, then vanishingly rare. He disappeared in front of witnesses, on a beach, in daylight, with an immediate, massive, well-resourced response, and the ocean took him completely, leaving not a single trace, and the most powerful investigative apparatus of his nation has spent nearly 60 years failing to explain it. What does that mean? It means something about the ocean, about how vast and indifferent and thorough the sea can be when it decides to keep something. Most disappearances leave the edges of an answer, a piece of evidence, a witness who saw something, a record that survived. The ocean at Cheviot Beach on December 17, 1967, left nothing. It means something about certainty, about how quickly we reach for explanations and how rarely those explanations survive close examination. Australia decided Holt had drowned the same day he disappeared. That decision was understandable, perhaps even correct, but it foreclosed inquiry in ways that the 2005 coronial finding implicitly acknowledged. It means something about power and exposure, about the gap between the public accountability we expect of leaders and the private vulnerability they carry. Harold Holt was, for all his authority, a man who walked into the ocean without bodyguards because he found their presence annoying. He was not a symbol on the beach. He was a person with a person's capacity to make a mistake in a moment of confidence. The four theories about what happened to Harold Holt can be reduced in the end to two questions. The first, did the ocean simply take him? A powerful but straightforward event, a drowning that left no trace. The second, did something else happen? something that required planning, cooperation, secrecy, and a deception that has now held for nearly 60 years. The coronial inquest looked at both possibilities and said, "Open." That is the official position. That is where the record ends. Harold Holt walked into the ocean on December 17, 1967, and the sea took him. Or the sea was the stage for something else entirely. The waves at Cheviot Beach have been breaking on those rocks ever since. The same swell, the same undertow, the same indifferent force that took a prime minister and left nothing behind. Whatever happened in that water, the ocean knows. The rest of us are still waiting.